Iron bites into your wrists. The wood beneath you groans with every wave. Salt-thick air claws at your lungs. Darkness swallows everything. But sound betrays all, the creak of timber, the slap of black water. The muffled weeping of women who once knelt beside you at dawn, whispering prayers you believed would shield you from the world's cruelty. 6 days before this, you were on your knees in Lindisfarne's chapel, a consecrated virgin, promised to God. Wrapped in certainty that sacred vows could hold back violence, that certainty bled out with the monks. Before we descend further into this abyss, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. It unsettles me honestly. That something this grim, born on an island so forgotten, still echoes across the globe 1,200 years later. The morning of June 8, 793 AD began like forgettable mornings do. Lindisfarne rested just beyond Northumbria's jagged coast. A place where sea and sky dissolved into gray nothingness. One of Christianity's crowning jewels. A monastery carved from Celtic devotion in the 7th century. Home to illuminated gospels glowing with gold leaf, reliquaries that caught candlelight like trapped stars, and the tomb of St. Cuthbert, whose bones supposedly bent reality itself. 47 monks breathed within those walls. 23 nuns occupied a smaller cloister nearby. Rumors had reached them, yes. Whispers carried by traders about distant raids. Villages devoured by flame along the Frisian coast. Silver ripped from altars. But those horrors felt distant. Unreal. Lindisfarne was sacred ground, protected, untouchable. The fog that morning hung unusually thick. Watchmen stationed in the tower saw nothing, until dragon-prowed ships were already slicing through surf by the time bells screamed their warning. It was already too late. The Vikings didn't announce themselves with words. No demands, no terms, just axes catching morning light. Moving with the terrible efficiency of men who'd perfected this choreography before. Monks who stumbled toward the beach thinking perhaps these were traders seeking shelter were cut down mid-greeting. Their blood darkened sand before understanding could dawn in their eyes. Others tried barricading chapel doors. The Vikings simply kicked them open. Some fled toward the cliffs. They were hunted like startled deer. Father Ealdwine, the abbot, was discovered kneeling before the altar, 73 years old. 5 decades spent copying scripture by candlelight. He died mid-prayer. His head severed on stones where he'd blessed bread every morning for 30 years. His blood filled the marble carvings. Drowning Latin inscriptions in red, the assault lasted less than 4 hours. By midday, silence reclaimed the monastery. 47 monks lay dead, every single one, but the 23 nuns, they still drew breath. For them, the nightmare was only beginning to unfold. The Vikings didn't seize women at random. They operated with cold system to grasp why they specifically hunted nuns. You need to understand slavery's architecture in Norse society. 8th century Scandinavia wasn't England's feudal patriarchy or France's rigid hierarchies. Women could claim land, dissolve marriages freely, command merchant operations, but slavery threaded through their economy like marrow through bone. And within that system, tiers existed. Common thralls broke their backs in fields, but a special category existed, ambot. Female slaves serving as permanent concubines, and within that category the most prized were frilla, Christian captives, preferably nuns, preferably virgins. The reasoning split 2 ways. First, religious humiliation. Vikings worshipped Odin, Thor, Freyja, gods embodying war, cunning, fertility's raw power. Capturing a woman who'd vowed eternal chastity to Christ and converting her into a concubine wasn't merely practical. It was theological conquest, proof their gods commanded greater power, desecration of Christianity's most sacred offering. Second, economic calculation. Nuns possessed education. They could decipher Latin, sometimes Greek. They understood medicinal herbs, weaving's intricate techniques, basic accounting. As slaves, they became multifunctional assets, domestic, reproductive, intellectual. So on that blood-soaked beach, while smoke crawled skyward from the burning scriptorium, selection began. Vikings stripped the nuns naked, examined them like livestock at market, checked teeth for decay, inspected skin for disease, estimated fertility with cold precision. Abbess Freyja, 52 years old, was deemed too worn, her throat opened on the spot. Her body surrendered to the tide. The remaining 22 women were sorted. 8 of the youngest, girls barely past adolescence, were marked for something the Vikings called blodband, the blood marriage. The rest received assignment as common ambot. One novice named Hild was only 15. She became one of the 8 chosen. She had no concept what that designation meant. She would learn. The 3-week voyage to Norway wasn't simply transportation. It was psychological dismantling. The Vikings didn't violate the nuns immediately, not the ones destined for blood marriage. They kept them chained in cargo holds. Dark, suffocating pits reeking of rotted fish and brine. Fed them scraps, moldy bread, dried fish so saturated with salt it burned going down. Forced them to relieve themselves where they sat before each other. Stripping away every fragment of dignity, systematic dehumanization. Engineered to shatter the identity they'd spent years constructing within cloister walls. Warriors visited regularly, not to violate them, not yet, but to humiliate through other means, force them to speak blasphemies against Christ, cut their hair, which nuns had kept long beneath veils as consecrated femininity's symbol, and cast it into the sea. Made them consume strong beer until they retched, breaking sobriety vows, forced them to witness animal sacrifices. Blood sprinkled over wooden idols carved to resemble Thor and Freyja, every act calculated, demonstration that their god didn't shield them. That vows meant nothing. That their identity as brides of Christ was illusion easily destroyed. Modern psychologists label this learned helplessness. In the 1960s, researcher Martin Seligman discovered when subjects learn nothing they attempt can alter their situation. If they cease trying, surrender emerges not from weakness, but because the brain scrambles to protect itself from madness. First you resist, then you realize resistance accomplishes nothing, then you stop resisting, then you stop feeling. The nuns in those shipholds were being systematically fractured, not through violence yet, but through degradation, isolation, unrelenting uncertainty. By the time Norwegian coast materialized, most had already surrendered internally. That was the entire point. When ships finally anchored, likely somewhere near Hordaland in western Norway's fjords, the next phase commenced. Nuns were taken to what the Norse called thralahus, slave houses. There they were washed for the first time in weeks, not from kindness. Because Vikings valued basic cleanliness in property, they were examined again by older Norse women, experts in assessing fertility, strength, childbirth suitability. Based on these evaluations, classification occurred. The 8 youngest and most desirable were prepared for blodband, the blood marriage. This ritual appears documented obliquely in Icelandic sagas. Though sagas often omit the most brutal details, it unfolded during Blot, a pagan religious festival celebrated 3 times yearly. The captive was brought to the Horger, a stone altar in forest clearings considered sacred ground. Naked, hands bound behind her back, the Jarl or Herseer, the local chieftain claiming her, stood before her in ceremonial armor, between them a Gothi, a pagan priest. Performed the rites. The Gothi sacrificed a horse, an animal sacred to Odin. He collected blood in a bronze bowl and mixed it with fermented mead, forced the captive to drink the mixture while reciting invocations to Freyja and Frigg, goddesses of fertility and marriage. Then the Jarl cut his own palm with a ritual knife, forced the captive to do the same. They pressed bleeding palms together while the Gothi bound them with leather cord, creating a blood bond that, according to Norse belief, united their spirits permanently. The final part of the ritual was public and brutal. The Jarl claimed the captive on the stone altar while the community watched. It wasn't passion, it was ceremony. Spectators chanted hymns to Freyja, beat shields rhythmically, drank mead when it ended. He marked her forehead with blood, claiming her as his Frilla. The entire ceremony could stretch for hours, depending on how many additional rites the Gothi deemed necessary. For the nuns of Lindisfarne, this ritual represented total annihilation of their previous identity. They had spent years, some decades, cultivating spiritual purity, memorized psalms, fasted until consciousness dimmed, flagellated their own flesh to suppress carnal desire. Their entire existence was constructed around virginity as sacrament. Now that virginity was torn away in a pagan ceremony specifically designed to profane what they considered most sacred. Many tried resisting, screaming prayers in Latin invoking the Virgin Mary, but Vikings interpreted resistance as proof the ritual was working, proof they were shattering the Christian God's power over these women after the blood marriage. Life as a Frilla followed established patterns. She lived in her master's longhouse, usually in a separate room from his legitimate wife but within the same family complex. She belonged to him entirely, available whenever he desired with no right to refuse. But domestic obligations also existed: weaving, cooking, tending gardens, caring for children. The nuns, with their literacy, were often assigned additional tasks: keeping trade records, teaching the master's children, preparing herbal medicines. Pregnancies were inevitable. Vikings valued fertility, believed many children ensured family prosperity. A Frilla who became pregnant received no special treatment, no rest. She worked until labor began. Gave birth assisted only by other slaves, returned to work days later. Babies born to Frilla existed in ambiguous legal status, not slaves, but not fully free either. The master could choose to recognize them as legitimate heirs, convert them to slaves, or practice eutyceting, where unwanted infants were left in forests to die. The nuns who'd spent entire adult lives in cloisters, protected from all male contact, now faced repeated pregnancies that ravaged their bodies without prior knowledge of childbirth. Without mental preparation, many died in labor. Those who survived often developed obstetric fistulas, internal injuries causing permanent incontinence. No corrective surgery existed in the 8th century. These women lived their remaining years with constant pain and humiliation. They could never escape. But what perhaps most thoroughly destroyed the nuns wasn't physical abuse. It was forced spiritual corruption. Vikings weren't content claiming their bodies. They wanted conversion. To make them abandon Christianity and embrace Norse gods, forced them to participate in blot sacrifices, where they had to help slaughter animals and sprinkle blood on idols. Made them pronounce vows to Freyja, asking for fertility and healthy children. Made them learn songs in Old Norse celebrating Viking conquests and mocking the crucified god. Some nuns resisted for years, praying the rosary in secret, tracing crosses in air when no one watched. But psychological pressure was immense. Their captors constantly ridiculed them. Where was their Christ now? Why didn't he rescue them? If their virginity had been so important, why did their God allow it to be stolen over time? Especially after years of captivity and multiple pregnancies, many began doubting. Some convinced themselves they'd been abandoned by God, that vows were no longer valid, that they had to adapt to survive. The process was sometimes facilitated by Viking legitimate wives, who developed complex relationships with their husbands' Frilla. Some wives saw Christian slaves as threats, treated them with extreme cruelty, beating them, burning them with hot irons, forcing them to perform the most degrading tasks. Others developed something resembling solidarity, recognizing both were victims of the same patriarchal system, though at different levels. These wives occasionally helped the Frilla, teaching them Norse customs, protecting them from worst punishments, even allowing them to keep hidden Christian symbols. A fragment preserved in an 11th century manuscript mentions a nun called Edith. Historians believe this may have been Hild's full Christian name. 15 when captured at Lindisfarne, gave birth 7 times in captivity, Only 2 children survived. She never stopped praying. Every night in silence, she whispered the paternoster while her master slept, when she died at 34. Worn out by pregnancies and labor, her master buried her with a small wooden cross she'd carved in secret. He had converted to Christianity 3 years earlier, and because of her, some nuns attempted suicide, mortal sin according to Catholic doctrine. But hell seemed preferable to the life they endured. They hanged themselves with leather cords when opportunity arose, threw themselves into frozen fjords during winter, ingested poisonous berries found in forests. But Vikings had developed techniques preventing suicide in valuable slaves, watched them constantly, kept them slightly malnourished to reduce physical strength, brutally punished any failed attempt. A slave who tried killing herself was publicly whipped, sometimes until consciousness fled, as warning to others. Historical records about the specific fate of Lindisfarne's nuns are fragmentary. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions the attack, says little about captives. A 9th-century letter written by Alcuin of York, a scholar who'd studied at Lindisfarne years before, laments the desecration of consecrated virgins. Gives no details. Only in Icelandic sagas written centuries later do indirect references appear. The Laxdæla saga mentions a Christian frilla named Melkorka, who knew how to read Latin and secretly taught her son about Christ. The Egil's saga speaks of an English slave who maintained her faith in secret, eventually converted her master before dying. Were these women the nuns of Lindisfarne? Impossible to know with certainty, but chronology aligns. Sagas were transmitted orally for generations before being written down, preserving distorted memories of real events, what we know with certainty. The pattern repeated hundreds of times over the next 2.5 centuries of the Viking Age. The monastery of Iona in Scotland was attacked in 802, 806, and 825, each time with nuns captured. The monastery of Kildare in Ireland was raided in 835. Nuns taken as slaves. Monasteries in France, Germany, even as far south as Iberia faced similar attacks. Vikings developed specific preference for coastal monasteries because they combined 3 objectives: wealth in gold and manuscripts, absence of significant military defenses, and presence of nuns and monks who could be enslaved. The final irony is devastating. These women, victims of pagan violence designed to humiliate Christianity, probably contributed more to Scandinavia's Christianization than any missionary expedition. They taught their mixed-blood children about Christ, kept faith alive in secret for decades. When Viking kings finally began converting to Christianity in the 10th century, many did so influenced by mothers, grandmothers, and concubines who'd preserved those beliefs despite the horror they'd suffered. St. Bridget of Kildare, whose monastery was raided multiple times, supposedly prayed that any nun captured by pagans would find strength to maintain faith in secret, and eventually convert her captors, if those prayers were answered. It was in ways the saint never would have imagined. Through violation, slavery, and decades of suffering that slowly eroded pagan belief from within, Vikings thought that by capturing and enslaving nuns they were demonstrating their god's superiority. But seeds of Christianity planted involuntarily in their homes, carried in wounds of violated women, eventually grew until they consumed the ancient Norse religion entirely. By the 12th century, no pagans remained in Scandinavia. Odin's temples were destroyed, priests converted or killed, the sagas themselves rewritten with Christian influences. Final victory, bitter and bloody, achieved on the bodies of women who never asked to be martyrs. In 2013, archaeologists excavating a Viking Age site in the Orkney Islands discovered a woman's grave. She was buried with a strange mix of objects: a Christian crucifix and a Thor's hammer, both placed on her chest. Isotope analysis of her teeth revealed she'd grown up in the British Isles. but lived most of her adult life in Scandinavia. She had evidence of multiple healed bone fractures consistent with domestic violence. She'd given birth at least 6 times. The archaeologists believe she was likely a nun or Christian woman captured young, enslaved for decades, eventually buried with symbols of both religions, reflecting the fractured identity captivity had imposed on her. The nuns of Lindisfarne and thousands like them from other raided monasteries have no names in history, no tombstones commemorating them, no saints' days dedicated to their memory. The Catholic Church, ashamed of its inability to protect them, preferred forgetting. Viking sagas remember them only as footnotes. Nameless slaves fulfilling domestic functions, but their bones rest in Scandinavian earth. Their DNA flows in the veins of millions. Their fragmented, distorted stories persist in legends and folklore. They deserve remembrance, not only as passive victims, but as women who survived unimaginable horror, who maintained fragments of identity and faith in impossible circumstances, and who unknowingly planted seeds that would eventually transform their captors. Their suffering was real, their resistance was heroic, and their story was deliberately erased for centuries. By an ashamed church and a romanticized Viking culture. There's a line in one of the sagas, brief, almost offhand, that has always haunted me. It describes a Christian slave woman who on her deathbed refused pagan rites. She whispered something in a language no one else understood when they asked what she'd said. Her son, half Norse, half English, translated, "I forgive you, not the Jarl who'd enslaved her, not the gods who'd failed her, just you, all of them." The world that had broken her, and the world she'd helped create. They never wrote her name down, but someone remembered that moment long enough to tell it, long enough for it to survive in fragments. It passed from one generation to the next, until it reached us 12 centuries later, still carrying the weight of what it meant to endure when endurance should have been impossible. If this story unsettled something in you, if it made you think about the voices history deliberately silenced, leave your thoughts below. These women deserve to be remembered.